let's continue the discussion with other important issues that affect brokers and agency relationships. Now, a couple other things to get into in this fun-filled day. When we're talking about material facts, folks, I want to give you an extra word of caution because North Carolina is a little scary. Some states operate a little bit differently, but in North Carolina, we have something called the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act, which I'm going to talk about more in just a second. We also have what we call the Doctrine of Caveat Emptor, and you are familiar with that because we talked about that in pre, but we got to make sure you understand exactly what it means. And then there's also a little bit of confusion about when we're dealing with properties that are allegedly being sold as is. So let's start with the first one. The North Carolina Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act deals with all businesses. And so it basically means that you can go after a business if they try to mislead you, if they give you, false information, if they try to induce you to buy, if they give you misleading advertising, if they fail to disclose things that are legally obligated to be disclosed, you can go after that business. Now, this doesn't apply between, for sale by owners and buyers, but us as real estate professionals, as businesses, we are subject to this. And so what this means is, folks, think about it. In North Carolina, there is a legal obligation to disclose material facts that you know reasonably should have known. If you fail to disclose those material facts, and then it becomes known that you knew them or could have found them out, had a buyer been given that information, there's a chance they may not have entered into that contract. Now, picture that your seller is not willing to make it right because you didn't disclose something, meaning giving back their due diligence or anything like that. That means the buyer could arguably take you to court and go after you under the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act, saying, I would have never entered into this contract if you have given me the information that you were legally required to give me, but you failed to do so. And as such, I lost $10,000 in due diligence, and I want you to reimburse me. They can do that. And please understand that this is subject to what we call treble damages. Treble means up to 3 times. So even though they may have only lost $10,000 due to your mistakes, you could be ordered to pay them back up to $30,000 because you failed to do things correctly. And that's why I'm telling you, when in doubt, disclose. There's a lot of people who don't realize, the level of which, options they have out there. But there are agents who are screwing themselves over because what's happening is they're listing homes. Buyers are discovering things in home inspections. Sellers are turning around and relisting properties without disclosing anything about issues. A new buyer is putting due diligence, and it's not that hard to figure out that this agent knew at that point. And they are getting their licenses taken, they're getting sued, and everything in between. It is pretty scary. Some states have different laws and rules, and this is one that you don't want to take lightly. Now, as I told you earlier, you are not allowed to just include disclaimers to absolve yourself of any liability. Okay? And so when I mean disclaimers, and we always see them, I told you there's only that one that I said arguably is okay, which is the school district. But the things that say like, well, according to seller, or square footage to be verified by the buyer's agent, or per tax records, or per builder's plans, or per architect's drawings. Folks, that's never going to absolve you in any way, shape, or form. In fact, in my opinion, that puts a target on your back. Because if the commission ever sees that in the MLS, they're going to say, well, we'd like to have a chat with you. If you think that this is okay, that means you're not doing your job and you're not verifying information. You know what the only acceptable disclaimer should be? If you think that any of these are a good idea, you ready for this? You want to know what the only acceptable one is? Here it is. I'm too lazy to verify the information. That's what you should put in there, to be completely honest, folks. And by the way, you should probably put that on your business card too, right? When you pass it out to the sellers. Now, before you hire me, just know I'm too lazy to verify the information, and I'm not going to be anything worth it to you. Folks, I always like to give a little bit of tough love in these classes, especially because I told you in this class, we're going to have you measure your house. No, it's not fun. Yes, it is homework. Yes, it is a pain in the butt. But folks, I want you to think about this. We are in an industry where we are helping people invest hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in real estate every single day. And if you're too lazy to verify information, if you're too lazy to do a homework assignment for post licensing, if you're too lazy to learn, folks, why should anybody hire you? They shouldn't. If you wouldn't hire yourself, nobody else should either. So the goal is to be the kind of agent that you would want anybody to hire, that they would be happy to hire you because you're going to find the information, you're going to do what you need to do, and you're going to represent them to the fullest. Now, I will bring another piece of vocabulary into the mix. There is, of course, there's misrepresentations and omissions, and one of the other pieces of language that always comes into play is what we call puffing. Okay? When I say puffing, I do not mean what Snoop Dogg and his friends do on a Friday night. A little bit of puff, puff, pass, all right? That's not the kind of puffing we're talking about. Puffing is an exaggeration in marketing, and real estate agents excel at puffing, right? Cozy, prettiest house on the golf course, best view of the ocean, great potential, good bone, right? We always make everything sound better than it actually is, because we're not going to put tiny, we're going to put cozy. We're not going to put turd on a stick. We're going to say fixer upper potential, right? We always got to zhuzh it up a little bit. Now, understand, puffing is not an issue until you go too far. Okay? If you say prettiest house on the golf course, and that's subjectively true to somebody, you're okay. If you say best view of the ocean, and it's got a dang good view of the ocean, you're arguably okay. But there is a step that you take it too far, and then you're now in trouble for misrepresentation. Let me give you an example. If I gave you an advertisement for a home, and I said, wonderful 2-bedroom waterfront home, step out your front door onto the beach, and with a little tender love and care, this home could be a perfect 10. That sounds like a lovely advertisement. And here's the house. That's a little beyond puffing. Listen, you walk out your front door, your side door, you jump out the window, you walk through the dilapidated wall. No matter which way you go, you're on the beach. And I bet you at high tide you get free seafood. Maybe we should advertise that as well. There's lobsters on their counter ready to go. Folks, if you go that route, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Now, as we keep talking about listing agents, as we talked about some of those misrepresentation and omissions examples, there is a greater standard for listing agents. Listing agents are held accountable for acquiring accurate information as they disseminate it to the public. And it is okay, as I said, for buyer's agents and sub-agents to believe the information unless there is a huge discrepancy or something to lead us to believe otherwise. Now, I also just want to point out, folks, if you look at this like Leave It to Beaver looking family over here, I just aspire to be the level of agent that this fine gentleman is. He's got listen, folks, a 6-button coat in the middle of summer. That is dedication to the cause, okay? Unless it's a formal event, I'm not even wearing a coat this time of year. I'm too big of a man to do that. I'm going to wear some short sleeve button-ups this time of year, but this man's got dedication, right? Full-fledged tie, 6-button coat. He's just on it. Maybe one day I'll grow up to be like him. So the listing agent, as I said, has this primary responsibility for putting the information in initially for the rest of the public. And as I said, there is reason to believe it. But as I was talking with Caroline earlier, a selling agent, meaning anybody who's working with a buyer, if they see anything that's a red flag or would show us that there is maybe concern, right? They're saying it's 3,000 square feet. It does not feel that big. We need to suggest we should probably measure this before we submit an offer or something like that, right? We need to make sure that we don't just leave it alone. If it says it's got this and we can't find it, if it says it's got, 3 bedrooms but the septic says 2, if it, whatever there is, if you've got a suspicion that it's not right, we need to advise our buyers of that before we submit the offer. So when we talk about special importance to a buyer, understand that this is a very important aspect of our job. Okay, we talked about this as a material fact, and I want to just give you some things to consider. It's always okay, and as we should be, to educate our clients on things that they maybe don't understand. But at the same time, they're the decision makers. So let me give you an example here. If you've got a buyer client who says, well, listen, I don't want a house with a septic system. Well, folks, you should only be looking at houses with sewer. Now, you are welcome to try to educate them on septics. Maybe they don't fully understand what that means. And if they change their mind, sure, but don't take them to septic houses without telling them that. Now, just as a quick little rundown of septics, if you're not familiar, we already talked about the permits a little bit. But the way a septic system works, folks, is you have what we call outlet pipes or drain pipes that leave your house. And they all come to a finite point, and they leave the house and they go into the septic tank. And the septic tank typically has at least 2 compartments. And so as one side fills up, there's typically a baffle wall right here where the liquids will flow over into the second compartment. And as the second compartment gets filled up, there's another drain pipe that leads out to what's called a distribution box. In that distribution box, there are several pipes, could be 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on the size of the system. And those are spaced out in the yard, typically on gravel or some other type of foam material. And what happens is the wastewater just goes into your yard. And it just gets absorbed and it gets naturally filtered through the sediment in the ground and returns to the aquifers underneath ground. It is a very efficient system. Now, there's nothing wrong with them as long as you maintain them. Now, that being said, once you educate your clients, if they still say, no, I don't want one, you can't change their mind, okay, well, don't take them to see one. But if they fully understand it and they want to see them, then you can take them. Just one supplemental piece here. When I talked about the liquids, folks, understand what happens. The solids stay at the bottom. And I'm going to let you use your imagination as to what I mean by solids, okay? The solids stay at the bottom. The liquids is what's going out into your fields and just getting absorbed. And then the naturally occurring bacteria, anaerobic bacteria, eats away at the solids. But still, you should have them checked and pumped every 2 to 4 years, depending on frequency of use, size of systems, things of that nature. Now, the biggest things, and this is something important, whether your client likes them or not, and this is true of city sewer or septic, don't you ever dump grease, oil, fats, wax, or anything down your drains, ever. And don't you ever flush anything other than toilet paper. I don't care if the wipes say they're flushable. They're lying to you. Don't you do it. No feminine products, no nothing goes down that drain other than toilet paper. The other big thing is don't go nuts with chemicals, because if you're using a lot of bleach and things of that nature, it can cause that bacteria that's in there doing its job to die, and then it will cause the system to back up. Now, there are, of course, 2 different types of systems as well. This is what's called a gravity-based system, so it always just kind of goes downhill. Sometimes topography doesn't work out that way. So if you ever see a septic system and it's got like a little fuse box and a light on the top, that is what's called a pump system. And so there is basically like floaters or bobbers in the back or in the tank, just like in the back of your toilet. And when water gets to a certain level, it will pump to, you know, the drain field uphill or whatever like that, because the gravity system's not going to work there. So there's your quick little rundown on septic systems. But if a client says that they do not want a septic system, then don't take them to them. And this is where I'll introduce what I like to call red flags, folks. Red flags are a very big part of our job as real estate professionals. Now, when I say red flags, I don't mean the kind with your ex, all right? The one that your mama warned you about. I can't help you with those. You should have listened to your mama, okay? What I'm talking about is real estate red flags. So let's go back to the septic conversation. If your clients say, well, I definitely want a place that has city sewer, city water, and you go and you take them to see a property and you're walking through the backyard and you see some septic tank risers, that's a red flag, isn't it? If this property is being advertised as city sewer, but there's things in the backyard that makes it look like it has septic tanks, then you need to be aware of that. I'll give you another example of this. I helped a client, and he wasn't too particular. It was a friend of mine. Helped him buy in Fuquay several years ago. And the house was marketed as septic tank, but city water. Yeah, septic tank, but city water. And so we get there, and everything, you know, screams septic tank. But when we first pull into the house, there is a well house in the front. You know, like the decorative ones that looks like an actual well trying to hide the well pump. And so I'm looking at it, and I said, well, hold on. It said it's city water. Why is there a well pump in the front yard? So I picked up the phone. I called the listing agent because that was a red flag to me. Are they advertising this wrong? Is there some type of confusion? And so, the listing agent talked to the seller and got back to us. And so here's the story. Apparently, the house was at one time on well water, but they had recently tied into the city water. But the well was still active, and it was actually connected to the spigots in the yard, which makes good sense. Because then when you're watering your plants and it actually had a pool, if you're filling your pool, you could use your well water and not have to pay for the water. So these are the types of red flags that we're looking for. Things that contradict what you've been told, things that may not be ideal to your client. And of course, this comes into material facts as well. Cracks in the foundation, water stains, any kind of standing water, overly soft soil, anything. Folks, the best time to go see a property is right after it rains. I know we hate going to houses in the rain, but going during when it's raining and going right after it rains is one of the best times to go take a look at the property. Why? Because then you're going to see some of the bigger issues that can happen from, improper drainage or things of that nature. So red flags is a huge part of our industry, both from a material facts point of view and representing our client's point of view. Now, one other piece here, and we're going to talk in detail, great detail about this in contracts and closings, post-licensing 302. But be very careful about communicating that we have a contract if we don't actually have one. Folks, you do not have a contract until the last party has signed and dated, and then they have communicated that signature and acceptance to the offeror or the offeror's agent. If somebody says, we're going to sign, we're interested in signing, we're thinking about signing, you don't have a contract. Do not tell anybody you have a contract. So if you state, hey, we're under contract and we don't have one, that is a misrepresentation. That's very important to understand because I can get you in trouble and people will get very upset about that and they will report you to the real estate commission. People do get upset and will report you to the commission if you say we got a contract and they come back later and like, oh no, the seller won't sign. They will report you. Now this next section, folks, this is the best place to put it in. This was something that was added in a couple years ago into the post-licensing curriculum. Why? It was something that was in Gen Up and they thought that it was worth having some discussions on. And so we put it in the post-licensing curriculum. And that is dealing with equity issues and racial equity and some things kind of going hand in hand with that. Now, I can give you the biggest pieces here pretty briefly. At the time that they rolled this out, that was when we had a lot of protests, a lot of, people in uproar and, being upset about certain things. And so ultimately the commission said, well, hey, listen, there's a lot of hostility. There's a lot of protests. There's a lot of people who are not good people. And while we can't fix the world tomorrow, we as an industry can do better. And so they basically said that, us as the North Carolina Real Estate Commission and us as real estate brokers in North Carolina, we need to just take a step back and we need to recommit to racial equity and making sure that all people are treated fairly and equally in all things, especially within our industry. And so 3 of the big concepts that came into play and came into discussions is what we call disparate impact, implicit bias, and racial equity. Disparate impact is when there is a rule, a doctrine, a law, or something like that, that at face value is seemingly equal and fair, but when you take a deeper dive into it, it disproportionately affects a protected class more than others. Implicit bias was a discussion because everybody's got biases. We are all a product of our upbringings, our religions, our national origins, our families, our social statuses, everything in between. And so while biases are not inherently a negative thing, right? Coke over Pepsi, right? There's nothing politically charging there or offensive, but there are some times that your biases do get into the level of discrimination. And it's becoming more aware about your implicit biases and how that you act on them and how certain things make you feel. And that was kind of the topic of conversation there. And then, of course, racial equity is all people should feel equal in all things all the time. And so the commission basically looked at these things and they said, okay, well, we're recommitting to our racial equity. Us as an industry, us as an institution, we're, we want to be the change. We want to make sure everything's good. So they actually had, and it's still something you can do, they had this disclaimer, this statement of their commitment to racial equity on the homepage. And then they also made an easy link for you to go in and you could suggest a rule change. If you ever thought that any of their laws or rules had that implicit bias or that disparate impact, that you could say, well, hey, I think we need to look at this. So a couple other things came from it as well, like a couple rule changes. Folks, we as real estate professionals have always had to follow fair housing laws. Always. But they took it a step further and they basically put in information. They said, if you were to advertise your business in a way that was also discriminatory, you can be in trouble. So let me give you an example. Saying things like, I speak Spanish, that's a skill set. That's okay. To say something like, I only work with Spanish-speaking clients, that can be deemed as discriminatory. And so that's how they were saying you cannot operate your business in a way that discriminates against working with people other than certain demographics. So they added in some laws and rules to clarify those things. And of course, as I said, we didn't really solve the world's problems, but we talked about implicit bias and some considerations and how things affect people. And one of the other big discussions, and this is actually making a comeback in this upcoming year's update, is what we call the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Folks, also referred to sometimes as Section 8 housing. And so it is basically where the government will subsidize the rent for people who apply for this program. And so at the time that we taught this, the big thing was that there was no, what we referred to as source of income discrimination, meaning discriminating based on where the money's coming from was not a protected class. Now, certain municipalities like Raleigh and like Durham, I believe it was, are looking into going after people for source of income discrimination. And the reason why this was a discussion is because while a homeowner is not required to participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it was discovered that a predominantly large number of minorities and people with disabilities participated. So when you didn't accept these Housing Choice Voucher programs, that was that disparate impact we were talking about. There was a lot of people who were subsequently affected that were falling into specific categories of the protected classes. So it is going to be another thing making a resurgence, but just being aware of the discussions there. And as I said, that was where one of the biggest examples of disparate impact and, how certain laws, rules, policies could inadvertently affect, people of certain religions, people of certain races, people with disabilities, and everything in between. So that's just always a consideration there. And that was it. I mean, folks, we all know that there's no answer. I think we would like to think that we could snap our fingers and make the world a better place, but there's just more complex than that. So every single day we make strides in the right direction is kind of the goal, to make it better and make it a little less problematic for the rest of the world. So that was the big piece there. Now let's get into a very important day in, day out conversation that we have to understand as real estate brokers. And this is very important, okay? Folks, you remember the doctrine of caveat emptor. You've heard this term before. What does this translate to?
Buyer beware.
Buyer beware. Okay, it's Latin, I believe. It's let the buyer beware. Doctrine of caveat emptor in North Carolina. And so understand that the doctrine of caveat emptor is a doctrine in regard to buyers and sellers, not us in any way, shape, or form. So what this means is that a seller does not have to disclose anything to the buyer, mostly. Now, I want to paint a picture for you here. If the seller knows their roof leaks, they don't have to tell the buyer. If a seller knows they have foundation issues, they don't have to tell the buyer. If the seller knows that there's a monster living in their basement, they don't have to tell the buyer. Folks, it doesn't matter how egregious or terrible it is. They do not have an obligation to disclose it to the buyer. That is what the doctrine of caveat emptor states. Now, that is only between the buyer and the seller. That has nothing to do with us, because we as licensees always have to discover and disclose all material facts. Always. Now, if you read into the doctrine of caveat emptor a little bit more in depth, there's actually a nuance to it. Okay, two things. They're not allowed to commit fraud and try to hide things. If they did that, you could go after them. And then the other thing is, it actually says if there was something that would be impossible to be discovered by a standard home inspection or impossible to be discovered in general, there is an obligation for sellers to disclose things that are impossible. It literally uses the word impossible to be discovered. But that's it. Otherwise, the sellers don't have to disclose anything. So let me paint a picture for you. And this is where you've got to understand how this ties in together. If the seller is filling out a property disclosure, the RPODS form, we're going to talk about that in section 2 in greater detail. And the seller knows their roof leaks. And on that RPODS, the seller puts, no, my roof doesn't leak. And the buyer finds out after the fact that the seller knew their roof leaked, they can take them to court and they can go after them for lying to them because they committed fraud. They lied. Conversely, if that same seller would have just put no representation and the buyer never finds out that the roof leaks and then they buy the house and it's leaking, they can't touch the seller with a 10-foot pole as long as the seller didn't try to hide it. If the seller tried to paint over leaks and try to lie about it and try to cover things up temporarily, sure, then you can go after them. But as long as they don't try to hide it, and as long as they don't lie about it, they're not in trouble. And this is a very important thing to understand in North Carolina, which is why we always, as real estate professionals, need to suggest home inspections to buyers. It is never a good idea to purchase a property. Because of this doctrine of caveat emptor, the burden is on us, the burden's on the buyers, the burden's on getting home inspections to try to discover everything and anything that may be pertinent or practical for our client. Now, please be aware that it may be difficult for a buyer to go after a seller because of this doctrine of caveat emptor. But if we fail in our obligations as buyer's agents to suggest home inspections, to suggest supplemental inspections, to make sure we look at things, to make sure we look in crawl spaces and everything in between, please understand it's not hard to go after us for messing up. We're very easy to find and we're very big targets. So when we're talking about the seller selling, the seller does not have to disclose anything, but regardless, I told you the listing agent has to discover and disclose anything and everything and then some. And so that's where we have the burden of asking questions. Folks, you can't just take things at face value. If you're going through a listing appointment and you see a water stain on the ceiling, it's not just, oh, there's a water stain. Ask the seller. Did it leak? Did you have it fixed? When was it done? Do you have invoices from it being fixed? Was there any mold? Was there any water damage? Was there any, whatever it may be, we need to ask questions. Now, do they have to tell us? No. But we still have an obligation to discover and disclose to everybody in the club getting tipsy, right? Everybody. I told you the seller would only be liable for engaging in fraud, trying to induce somebody to forego inspections, and of course there are liabilities for failure to provide disclosure forms in some instances as well. We're going to talk about those in great detail. And so that means that the burden is all on us, folks. Because really and truthfully, there's no one else to go after. Because of this antiquated rule called the doctrine of caveat emptor, we have to help, to the best of our ability, clients learn things that are important to them. Now, let me throw in the other thing that I told you we're going to talk about, and that is a property that is being sold as is. Folks, what does as is mean? That is very astute, Katina. I appreciate that. I mean, you're not wrong. But what does it really mean?
Is it just they're not going to do any repairs or anything that's done? It's, what you see is what you get, I guess.
Yeah. It really translates to the seller does not desire to make any repairs for you. Don't ask us. Now, please understand, you can still ask, but they're probably just going to say no. Now, understand that even though a property may be being sold as is, meaning the seller doesn't wish to make repairs, that doesn't change our obligations in any way, shape, and form. Doesn't lessen it, doesn't mitigate it, doesn't remove it, folks. we still, even if the property is being sold as is, have to discover and disclose all material facts about the property and disseminate them to the public. And so here's my question to you. If even a property being sold as is wouldn't remove our duty of discovering and disclosing material facts, here's my question. What would? What would remove our obligation of discovering and disclosing material facts?
Is it like a foreclosure?
Nope. Still obligated there.
Oh, okay.
Would it be latent issues? Issues we can't see?
Sure. I mean, but we still need to discover and disclose things that we can find. But you're right. Latent, we don't have we can't find or don't have to find. But that's still, I mean, we would still need to investigate to the best of our ability. Think about it. What would remove our obligation as licensees to discover and disclose material facts?
Would it be if you have permission from the buyer?
Nope. You ready for this? You're going to kick yourselves when I tell you. Nothing. It was a trick question. Nothing. Folks, I'll make you feel a little bit better. There was an actual answer. You ready for this? You take your license off the wall and you walk down to 1313 Navajo Drive and you say, here, have this back. That's the only thing you can do. You can turn your license in. If you are no longer a broker, then you have absolved yourself from having to discover and disclose material facts. But so long as you're a broker, folks, nothing absolves you of that duty. Nothing. So, when we're talking about agency relationship, folks, this is where we start getting into some of the more specific conversations here. I told you we form relationships with buyers and sellers and property owners and tenant representation agreements. And of course, that can be in residential and commercial transactions. And so there are several different options that arise for these relationships. Now, I want to talk about a few things here because there's some very important language. Exclusive seller agency, exclusive buyer agency, and then both seller and buyer agency. Well, folks, let's talk about this word exclusive. What does exclusive mean?
You represent one person only, or husband and wife, whoever.
There you go. Exclusive is just the two of us, right? You remember that song? Just the two of us. You remember that? I can't sing. I'm not going to sing it to you. But, folks, that's exclusive. And listen, if you don't believe me, okay, that's what exclusive means, you go after class today and you go ask your significant other if you can bring a third wheel into the mix, okay? I don't know to what extent you're going to ask them to do that, and you see what they tell you, folks. They gonna gut you like a chicken, all right? There is no such thing as three people in exclusive. Exclusive is you and me and you, just the two of us, okay? That's what exclusive means. So if I say exclusive seller agency, folks, as an agent, who is the only person you care about?
Seller.
The seller. That's the name's in there, right? Exclusive, just the two of us. Only the seller. It's the only person we care about. So if I say exclusive buyer agency, who's the only person we care about?
Buyer.
The buyer. And then the last one says both buyer and seller agency. Well, folks, we can't call that exclusive. Because if you got a buyer that you're looking after, you got a seller that you're looking after, folks, ain't nothing exclusive about that. In any way, shape, and form, we got some major conflicting interests. And before I even take it further, I want to go ahead and get your minds right to help you understand some of the discussions that are going to come into agency. I want you to talk to me, and I want you to tell me like I'm stupid, like I don't know nothing. What is your job as a buyer's agent? Dumb it down for me.
I mean, just help them buy a house that meets their criteria.
Help them buy a house that meets their criteria. Now, let me play devil's advocate here, Matt. Are you going to make them overpay for that house?
No, you're looking out for their best interest.
You're looking after their best interest. So arguably, if you wanted to dumb it down even further, what should you try to get them?
The best deal.
The best deal. Can we agree on that? And folks, if I find you your dream house and it's listed at $400,000, and I think I could get it to you for you for $380,000, I have a legal obligation to do that. Because if I'm looking out for your best interest, saving you $20,000 sounds like it'd be in your best interest, doesn't it? So I agree with you. Let's combine it. Looking after the buyer, getting them in a home they want, and getting them the best deal. Can we agree that that's a pretty good synopsis of a buyer's agent? Okay. Let's look at the other side of the coin. What if I'm a seller's agent? Dumb it down for me. What's your job?
I mean, get the highest price you can.
Sell the house, get the most stinking money. Folks, I want to sell my seller's house for so much stinking money that they start making questionable decisions, okay? They go out and they buy a sports car, okay? Do some drugs, party. No, I'm kidding. I'm just making sure you're all awake. No, drugs are bad, okay? But you want to make them as much money as humanly possible. And so here's the thing. If you're looking after the buyer and that's your job as a buyer's agent, you're looking after the seller and that's your job as the seller's agent, ain't nothing exclusive about this, is there? If you're got 3 people in a relationship and you're promising one thing to one person and the exact opposite to the other person, how on God's green earth do you do that? Which is why we don't call dual agency exclusive. There's nothing exclusive about dual agency. It's just called dual agency. But if we say exclusive seller agency, you only care about the seller. If we say exclusive buyer agency, you only care about the buyer. Now, I'll give you a little forewarning, and I'll kind of explain it to you more in just a moment, but there is actually 2 different contexts that we have to talk about in the agency discussion for the word exclusive. We just touched on one, same meaning, different context. And so I'll talk to you about that in just a second. So exclusive seller agency, exclusive buyer agency, dual agency, okay? These are our options. Now, folks, in North Carolina, we practice what we call fiduciary brokerage, which means we always have to represent somebody in North Carolina. We got to have a person. So we're either representing the buyer or the seller or both. In some states, they can do it a little bit differently. So when we're forming a relationship, we would need to form an agreement with somebody in some way, shape, or form. And so let me give you some specialized agreements. Now, this first one is one that is about to get turned upside down. In North Carolina, all agency agreements ultimately have to be in writing. Every single one of them will ultimately have to be in writing, the way that the rule sits right now. And that is the agency agreement and disclosure rule, which is Rule 58A.0104. But what it does say is that you can have oral buyer agency to start. Okay, that's the only relationship that you can form from an oral point of view, meaning verbally discussing it, initially speaking. Now, I'll give you a couple other pieces here because there's a couple laws and rules that come into play. So when we're talking about disclosure, when you're dealing with buyer agents, if you are already representing a buyer client, there is a disclosure obligation to tell the seller or the seller's agent that you are a buyer's agent at initial contact. For everybody else, when we're talking about the working with real estate agents disclosure, it's called first substantial contact. And we're going to talk more about that. But what that means is, folks, well, you tell me, why do you think, and let's see if you got an understanding of what we're talking about on this page, and if not, I'll really spell it out for you. Why do you think it's so important for us, if we're already representing a buyer client, to tell a seller or a seller's agent that at initial contact?
To prevent, oh, go ahead. To prevent them from disclosing any personal information that you can use against them.
Absolutely.
To find a better deal.
Yeah. But why would they ever potentially give us that information, though?
Some people unfortunately like to overshare.
Well, you're not wrong, Katina. Some people absolutely love to overshare. Listen, my mom is notorious for that. She'll meet somebody on the street, and before you know it, she'll give them my whole life story or her whole life story. I said, Mom, that nobody cares. They're just trying to shop. Leave this poor person alone. So some people like to overshare, but there's another more legally based reason as to it. And I'll give you a hint. It's on this slide. I'll help you out. Folks, there is a big disconnect sometimes with understanding what seller subagency is. Earlier, I introduced the word subagent. And a subagent is just the agent of an agent, okay? And so if all of us work for ABC Realty and a buyer hires ABC Realty, well, all of us are subagents of the buyer. Same thing for sellers. But when I say seller subagency, it is actually an exceptionally specific thing. And so I want you to think about this in North Carolina, and I'm going to give you some insight, and it's going to be situational here. And you may have some questions, but I'm going to explain it a couple of different ways. So let's give you kind of like a precursor lesson, all right? Let's say that Ashley picks up the phone, and she calls me, and I'm an agent and she's not. And she says, Seth, I found you on Zillow and I think you look like a great agent. I'd like for you to show me 123 Main Street. Can you do that? I'm going to say, Ashley, of course I can. Also, thanks for noticing. I'm the best. And so I'd be happy to help you. I'm a little cocky. But so Ashley and I go and we meet at 123 Main Street. Now, folks, just piece this back together from your, previous education. What is the first thing that Ashley and I are going to go over when I'm meeting her for the first time?
Working with real estate agents.
The working with real estate agents disclosure, because, and we're going to get into that in a slide in just a second, the trigger for that is first substantial contact. Once again, when we go into any of that confidential territory, price, terms, motivation. Well, folks, if I'm about to show a house to a potential buyer, what is the biggest, most prevalent question that every agent would probably want to ask a buyer before even showing them a house? Hope you just muted back, Caroline. Yeah. What's your budget? And then I saw Caroline mouth it, are you pre-approved? Right? Folks, the thing is, if I ask that question, we're about to have first substantial contact, aren't we? And so the stance of the North Carolina Real Estate Commission is you better have given somebody the working with the real estate agent's disclosure before you show them a house. Now, I'm going to take this a step further. Believe it or not, and this is where it's going to hurt your feelings, because your friends, your peers, you're going to be guilty of this at some point. I've been a real estate broker for 9 years. I know people violate this. You ready for this? You're not technically allowed to show a house unless you have a relationship with somebody. And so after I go over the working with real estate agents disclosure with Ashley, what's the next step, folks? The working with real estate agents disclosure is just telling her what options exist. Let's just call it that right now. I'll give you a more in-depth lesson in a second. So after I tell her what options exist, what am I going to ask her?
Is she working with an agent?
Is she working with an agent? And when she says no, now what I'm going to ask her?
Would she like you to represent her?
Can I be your agent? That's exactly right. I'd love to be your agent, Ashley. If you ain't got nobody, I'll help you out. Now, folks, I've explained agency to her on this working with real estate agents disclosure, but I want you to picture something here. I go to Ashley and I say, Ashley, I'd love to be your agent. Can I represent you? Now, we're going to talk about this as well, but I could start off with an oral buyer agency agreement with Ashley, or we could sign a written buyer agency agreement from the word go. Either is okay the way the law sits right now. So I want you to imagine that I tell her this and I tell her these options and I say, so are you willing to hire me? And she looks at me and she says, oral buyer agency agreement, written buyer agency agreement, hire Seth. Tell you what, Seth, I watch a lot of Selling Sunset and HGTV, and so I think I'm pretty smart about these kinds of things. I don't think I necessarily need an agent. I just want to see the pretty house. So is it okay if I don't hire you and I just be unrepresented? Sure it is. It's completely legal. So here's my question, folks. can I show her the house?
You can, but you'd be working for the seller, not her.
Folks, that's the thing. In North Carolina, you have to represent somebody. She, as the buyer, didn't hire me. Who is the only other person I can be working for?
The seller.
The seller. And so that is seller subagency. Now, folks, here's the reason why you have to disclose agency status at initial contact. Imagine that Ashley and I go through this home. She's an ooh and an on. She loves it, okay? And we get done looking at it, and she wants to submit an offer. Can I submit an offer for Ashley?
If she's unrepresented, yes, but there's a different agreement you have to do.
So we're going to say I can put in an offer for her, and there may be some technical aspects to it, okay? Now, folks, here's the thing. If I was sitting there with Ashley, she says, Seth, I want to put in an offer. I said, great. What do you want to offer? And Ashley looks at me and she says, well, Seth, what do you think I should offer? What should I tell Ashley?
Yeah, you can't advise her because she didn't hire you. And
Right.
you don't have an exclusive contract with her.
There you go. Because my loyalties are technically with the seller if I'm a seller sub-agent. So I'm going to look at Ashley, and this is what I'm going to say. Ashley, you know what? Why don't you go rewatch season 2 of Selling Sunset and see if the answer just manifests in your head, and then you come back and tell me what you want to offer, right? She's probably going to be mad. She's like, fine, Seth, fine. If you can't tell me, can you tell me what it's listed at least? I say, Ashley, I'd love to. It's listed at $400,000. And then here's what Ashley says. Well, fine. She says, okay, I really like this house. And I want this house, but I'm pretty smart and I know how to negotiate. So I'm going to start with an offer of $380. But I'd be willing to go up to $450 if I had to. But let's start with $380. Okay. And some of you can already see where this is going. Okay. So this is what she says. And I say, okay, so $380 it is, Ashley. She says, mm-hmm. And so I draft up an offer for $380. Okay. And Matt is my listing agent. So I pick up the phone. I call Matt to tell him about this offer that I'm about to send. And what am I going to say to Matt when I get him on the phone?
She's willing to go up to 400
$450.
or 450.
450.
Yeah.
So understand what I'm going to say to Matt. I'm going to say, hey, Matt, I've got an offer from a buyer customer for our seller client. And the offer is for $380. But this buyer said she'd go up to $450. Tell your sellers to put a strike through on $380, counter at $450, send it back to me, and let's take this girl to the cleaners. Okay? And Matt says, bet. So he gets it back to the sellers. The seller signs it, he counters, he brings it back. I'm going to say, Ashley, good news. She says, what? I said, I got a counter for you already. She's like, already? We just sent it. I said, I know. It's crazy how fast that was. And she's going to say, well, what's the counter for? And I'm going to say, $450. And she's going to say, $450. That's so weird. I said that's the most I would go up to. How did they know that I was going to go up to $450? And I'm going to look Ashley in the face, and without missing a beat, I'm going to look at her and say, because I told them you would go up to $450, Ashley. I don't work for you. You're not supposed to tell me your secrets. Take you to the cleaners. Folks, because she's a customer. The seller's a client. Now, I want you to piece together back my initial question. Why is it so important to disclose to a seller or a seller's agent at initial contact if you're representing the buyer?
I'm sorry, what was that question? I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. So the question again is, now that I've explained this seller subagency concept a little more in detail, why do you think the rules require us to disclose at initial contact, meaning the second we start talking to a seller or seller's agent, why do we have to disclose to them at initial contact that we're already representing a buyer?
So that they don't give give you any information that, again, you can use against them.
Right, because we realize there is the potential for us to be on the same team. In that scenario, I called the seller's agent, and Matt and I were on the same team. Both of us wanted what was best for the seller. And so arguably in that position, Matt could tell me the seller's secrets so I could get a better closing date for the seller, so I could get more money for the seller, so I could do whatever because we're on the same team. But if I am already representing, let's change the scenario. Instead, Ashley had hired me as her buyer's agent. Well, folks, when I pick up the phone and I call Matt, I'm going to say, Matt, I have a buyer client who's interested in your seller's listing. That tells him we're not on the same team. Do not ever think that we are. I'm going for blood. We have this automatic conflict of interest. And so it's important to understand that. So that's why when you are already representing a buyer, you have to disclose to a seller or a seller's agent at initial contact. Now, of course, the question I get from some of my even newer licensees, more often in pre, I'm sure you understand this at this point, because sometimes they're like, well, Seth, why would you ever be talking to a seller directly? Because the rule says seller's agent or seller, initial contact. Well, folks, you think there's times where you're hired by a buyer to be a buyer's agent and they're interested in a for sale by owner? There's no agent to call, right? So when you call the seller directly, you have to tell them, I'm not looking after your best interest. I have a buyer client who likes your house. Don't tell me your secret, slick, or I will use and abuse you. That make sense? Seller subagency is not a very common practice across brokerage firms. It's very common in-house. It's not a very common practice across firms. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist because there are several that do it. But the reason they don't, we're going to talk about it in a little bit, is because of a concept called vicarious liability. So there's just a little bit of a segue into some of the topics. So now the seller subagents, here's that vicarious liability. And as I said, in the agency concepts, we're going to talk more. And so let me explain vicarious liability. Folks, imagine that Matt and I in that scenario work together. And let's say that he's with ABC Realty and I'm with XYZ Realty. There's a good chance he doesn't know a thing about me as an agent, isn't there? I could be a moron, couldn't I? There's a good chance my firm could be full of morons and terrible training. And so if he agrees that we're going to play on the same team and I screw up royally because we're on the same team, he could be held liable. And so it's a very big risk when you do this, because let's say that I screw up and I share information and the seller's mad about it. And the seller says, well, Matt, you said it was fine for this person to play on our team and now I've been damaged. Or maybe we screw up with the customer and don't do things legally the correct way. And now the customer wants to report us to the commission. We may be both liable because we're on the same team. So that's the risk there, is people not knowing exactly what your level is in a transaction, knowing what you know and what you don't know to protect yourself from these issues. But some firms do seller subagency. Some don't. Ultimately, folks, if you're ever wondering if they are or are not doing seller subagency, look in the MLS. On the MLS, it will say how much we're offering to a buyer's agent, how much we're offering to a seller subagent. And if there's no compensation in the seller subagency field, then they're not working with seller subagents. But if there is, that means they are.